So friends, in the first part of the discussion, Professor Payal Nagpal has talked about the different elements that are reflected in the short story, The Lifted Veil by George Eliot. And it is a kind of debate that was going on in the 19th century regarding the medical profession. It also talks about the point of view of the woman in the garb of a male or a male character directly, and Professor Payal Nagpal has left the question open there. And thirdly, that it's also a kind of a thriller or a crime fiction or a suggested psychological attempt by the author to experiment with the form itself. So these points have been already indicated very firmly and very clearly by Professor Payal Nagpal. So I would request her now to take us further in the direction of exploration of the characters. You have already made me, very conscious about the different characters and their understanding of things through Latimer's eye. So
Yes.
you might think of this, and you have to add your own.
Yes. Here, I think, firstly, if you look at it, George Eliot is extremely conscious about the fact that, she's writing something that involves a lot of medical science. And if we just look at, the first lines of this particular story, it's very, very, I think it just says it all. So it says, the time of my end approaches. I have lately been subject to attacks of angina pectoris, and in the ordinary course of things, my physician tells me I may fairly hope that my life will not be protracted many months. Unless then I am cursed with an exceptional physical constitution, as I am cursed with an exceptional mental character, I shall not much longer groan under the wearisome burden of this earthly existence. If it were to be otherwise, if I were to live on to the age most men desire and provide for, I should for once have known whether the miseries of delusive expectation can outweigh the miseries of true prevision. For I foresee when I shall die and everything that will happen in my last moments. So everything is already, in a sense, packed in these first couple of lines in the story, where we know that we are looking at a character, this first person, male narrator, somebody who's not well. At the same time, it's somebody who has what he calls previsions. He can foresee and he actually predicts how he's going to die and when he's going to die. So he says, just a month from this day on, 20th of September 1850, he says, I shall be sitting in this chair in this study at 10 o'clock at night, and he's going to he would be longing to die, weary of insight and foresight and so on. So he knows, and he says that nobody is going to answer his bell. The two servants are lovers, they would have quarreled, the housekeeper would have rushed out of the house and so on. So it's all, he already knows it all, and the sense of suffocation will increase, and finally, he would be gone. So there is a comparison here, in a sense, between the physical world of the characters and their inner lives. The story is, once again important for playing out this interiority through the previsions or clairvoyance, in a sense, of Latimer. And we know that it's only much later that, we really speaking towards the end of the 19th century, that we have different movements, the avant-garde movements, different manifestos being written, the idea of, be it the Bergsonian notion of time, or be it the whole Freudian theory. All these things are happening later, but George Eliot is already thinking about, one, the physical world of the characters and their inner lives. What are they thinking about? What is their inner narrative all about? So this is presented, in a sense, in a new form, and it's not happening, in a sense, for the first time, but it, I think, is something that George Eliot is thinking about in a very concrete way, and she's grappling with it in this particular story. The life of the protagonist here is, there is development here to begin with, from early years to his youth, and then, because there are moments, when in this particular story, when the craft is also hinted at. So he would say that, well, brevity is important, and let me just, move on many years to what happened many years later. So we know about the time period of his growing up, his youth, his meeting Bertha, and what happens, after they are married? Are there years of happiness, or does marriage immediately lead to a certain kind of disillusionment? All that is skipped, and we suddenly move towards the end. So here, we see the character in a sense from his memory, as of course crafted by the author, but the reliable, and within quotes, unreliable aspect is that of the narrator's memory. So he is fond of his mother, but his father appears as somebody who's very strict. So a full paraphernalia of society, the mother being a second wife, father being a middle-aged man, and he's the odd child, son of a banker. So all this shows how Eliot also understands the changes that are taking place in the society. And especially what's interesting is the bit about the banker. So how he's this firm and unbending sort of man, but with a flourishing graft of the active landholder. So how that generation is connected very well to belonging to the feudal landholding society, and from there to becoming a banker. So he says about the father that he's one of those people who are always like themselves, uninfluenced by the weather and so on. Now again, another aspect of society that we get to know about here is how the property and everything is, in a sense, to really speaking, go to the eldest son. And the eldest son is not Latimer, it's Alfred. Latimer is always the effeminate one, not going to be taking decisions and so on, whereas Alfred is the typical, stereotypical male who's going out hunting, and who's, who has all the attributes of the young man. And and of course, Bertha, in a sense, is betrothed to Alfred and not to Latimer. So here again, to this negative view, in a sense, there's a positive view that's added, derived from that really scientific education was a really useful training for a younger son, because the younger son was expected to do something else altogether with his life, whereas the eldest son would be the one inheriting everything. So it was quite clear that his education was different from that of Alfred, where private tutors and science and modern languages, all these things were kind of done for him. So as I said, there is almost a sense of a Bildungsroman here building up, and but it's just left at that, and as I said, that many years are then kind of skipped over. So he also does not have too many friends, and as mentioned, one of the friends that he has is Charles Munier, who has an English name, but he chooses not to use the English name, and he calls him Charles. So it was a youth, he refers to him as a youth whose intellectual tendencies, he says, were the reverse of his own. And he was more contemplative. Why were they reverse? Because Latimer was more into his clairvoyance, his previsions and thinking, whereas Charles was more into experimenting with real science. Conducting experiments was what he was into. So, and it is this kind of a bond that he had with him, which was more of an intellectual bond, as he calls it. Now, having said this, and here, the stage is said, this is as far as Charles and Latimer's friendship is concerned, and Latimer's growing up years. The important aspect in this particular story are the three visions, as mentioned. So one is about Prague, and the first time round this happens, and I'm quoting from the story now. So it says, "Was this a dream? This wonderfully distinct vision, minute in its distinctness, down to a patch of rainbow light on the pavement, transmitted through a colored lamp in the shape of a star of a strange city, quite unfamiliar to my imagination." He says, "I had seen no picture of Prague. It lay in my mind as a mere name." So with vaguely remembered historical associations, ill-defined memories, and so on. So, but when he actually sees, when he goes to Prague, it's exactly what he had seen. Now, we can't simply go by this, because George Eliot also tells us that this is his narrative. So how reliable can this narrative, really speaking, be? But what's important here is, I think there are so many impulses of the time that one sees in the story, right from science, pseudoscience, experiment, the idea of interiority, the assertion of women. I think there is a lot that George Eliot has packed into this story.
I'm slightly curious about knowing, how Latimer came to marry Bertha when Bertha was meant to be the wife of the elder son.
Yes,
What
so
was the
I'm
problem?
just going to come to this. So what happens is that it's very clear that Bertha is she's engaged to be married to Alfred. And at the same time, she's very fond of Latimer. And Latimer once gets a little gift for her. Everybody gets her a piece of jewelry, and he also gives her an opal. And so where she wears what everybody else had given her, she does not wear what to Latimer it seems she's not wearing his gift to her. And she then says that, well, you're quite a fool, and she says that she was wearing it closest to her heart, so she was actually wearing it in a chain and Latimer could not see it. So and she absolutely declares to Latimer that she's not in love with Alfred, and that in fact marriage is a different thing and love is an entirely different thing, is what she says. So
how does she justify this to herself?
She's quite clear about it. There is no scope, in a sense, there's no need for her to justify it, because this is what she strongly believes in. And it so happens that Alfred dies, and that's how Latimer steps into Alfred's shoes. And of course, with respect to property, with respect to this marriage, he gets it all, in a sense.
So Bertha is a very dynamic person then?
Yes.
Very secular, very world oriented, and at the same time quite a making of a successful woman.
So that is how we would like to read Bertha, because as I said, that Bertha's narrative is not available to us. Why does she have this immense hatred towards him, so much so that she wants to kill him? Why is it that she has absolutely no illusions about marriage? We are talking about mid-19th century. She does not claim any illusions about marriage, about love within marriage, or about being, in a sense, the dutiful wife. She's none of these things.
Does it come out well in the narration?
Yes, this does.
How does it come out?
So this comes out through Latimer's hatred, in a sense, for her.
Okay.
So because Latimer is, much as he's projected as somebody who's effeminate, but he also is a product of his times, who would expect a stereotyping, in a sense, of gender when it comes to his wife, so to say, within quotes.
Isn't it interesting that Latimer actually is also resisting in his own way the dominance of the woman, because she is far more successful and far more intelligent than him.
Yes.
And he is effeminate, as you say.
Absolutely, and at one point she almost calls him quite a fool. So, and
yes.
especially in this particular episode. So, I'll just, also kind of explain this. So, of course, when it came to, after the Prague episode, the second was, when the whole, he suddenly saw Mrs. Fillmore, and he saw this beautiful screen, and he saw Bertha, and he had never met Bertha before this. And suddenly, when when this vision ends, he suddenly enters the room only to see that what he had actually seen in his imagination, the vision that he had, actually came out to be true. And he's very concerned. He faints and wonders that, is this a disease of some sort? Is it an intermittent delirium, concentrating my energy of brain into moments of unhealthy activity? He says, I felt a dizzy sense of unreality in what my eyes rested on. So, but when he returns, as I said, to the salon, there he sees Bertha Grant and he sees Mrs. Fillmore. So these two episodes almost tell him that, he is somebody who is able to see through the exterior into the real goings on in a person's mind, and this could be through a prevision or otherwise also. So there is this assumed rivalry that he has with his brother over Bertha, which is again something that's going on in his mind. But what's very interesting, something that we've been discussing, is how he sees Bertha. So he says about Bertha that she was keen, sarcastic, unimaginative, prematurely cynical, remaining critical and unmoved in the most impressive scenes. Now, here is a woman that he sees as unmoved, but one could also see this as a woman who is able to see the society for what it is, and when she is able to do so, she obviously will have the greatest distaste for a society that oppresses the women. So, there is almost contempt that one sees in Bertha. So, to this moment, he says that he was unable to define his feelings, really speaking towards her, and Bertha was the only being, he says, that who remained for him in the mysterious seclusion of soul is the term that he uses. So he also, says that he might have been very physically attracted to her, to be in love with, a brave femme, as he calls it, a brave woman. So here again, Bertha also, according to him, has had what he calls a spirit of intrigue. And when he asks her, when the opal stone that he gives, and he says that, do you despise it? She answered, taking hold of a delicate gold chain that she wore around her neck, and drawing out the end from her bosom with the ring hanging to it, she says, it hurts me a little, I can tell you, she said, to wear it in that secret place, and since your poetical nature is so stupid as to prefer a more public position, I shall not endure the pain any longer. And she takes that ring out from the chain. So here is, Bertha speaks very little in this particular narrative, but here when she does, she, well, be it the bit about not being in love with Alfred and looking at him as somebody who's very stupid, here I think a veil is lifted, really, so to say, from Bertha's point of view. So,
no,
yes.
I see. I think Bertha is able to, even though it happens in the narrative of the male, the husband, but Bertha's character comes out quite strongly here.
Yes.
And in the wit, that she shows about that chain being hurting her at a special place in her body, and then she takes it out and she makes it very clear that she doesn't like him.
Yes.
So if the woman doesn't like, and she makes it clear, and she does it in such a clever manner, and on the other side is the man, the male, who lives more in visions than in reality, then it becomes a twisted tale of a very, very I think it's of a wicked kind.
Very wicked, very wicked. In
Yes.
fact, I mean, I was actually reminded of Ibsen's Hedda Gabler, where a play again that completely makes it difficult to really understand that play in terms of gender. So.
Well, there is one question I would like to ask. Sorry,
Yes.
I am interrupting
No,
you.
no,
What is the use of visions here? What do they signify in the story?
I think here George Eliot is kind of talking about what was happening in the mid-19th century. So I think this belief in, which is why a lot of critics also use the term pseudo-scientific methods, that a lot of people were projecting this to be a certain kind of science, a certain kind of spiritualism, the seance, the clairvoyance. And I think that through Bertha, she actually almost rejects it. And Bertha has great she has great repugnance almost, for her husband,
Rightly.
for him,
Rightly.
absolutely, for being this clairvoyant, for his visions. So where, George Eliot is kind of, incorporating this in her story, this element of clairvoyance and so on, but it's not as if, I think it's more about what was happening at the time. So she's just taking that, and even if it were society, real life is a different thing altogether, because despite his clairvoyance, he's not able to understand, really speaking, what Bertha wants. And
Suppose I say that these visions, this act of clairvoyance, this act actually is both real and unreal. Would you agree?
Yes, I would say that it is both real and unreal here.
So that's a kind of realism.
Yes.
that is there, ingrained in the short story.
In the short story. So on the one hand, the clairvoyance allows us to actually penetrate through the surface reality in a sense to see. And you know, one could also look at it in terms of imagination, because she also brings in imagination here. So if it is to do with imagination, then it becomes an important aspect of reality.
And Freud is knocking at the door.
Knocking at the door, yes.
He will very soon appear as a person who will go into the niceties, the subtleties, the intricacies of the human mind.
And in fact, I think this particular story, I think one probably needs to pay more attention to this story, because it is that absolutely perfect bridge towards the end of the 19th century. So, I mean, be it the level of craft, I think, you know, there's so much, for instance, after the two get married, that's Bertha and Latimer. She does not dwell on it, because it suddenly moves to, you know, what she finally wants to talk about at the end of the story. So, you know, here again, the third vision that we have here is about, you know, he says, I felt myself sitting in my father's leather chair, fireplace, the dogs, the wood fire, and so on. And the light became stronger, for Bertha was entering with a candle in her hand. Bertha, he says, my wife, with cruel eyes, with green jewels and green leaves on her white ball dress, every hateful thought within her present to me. And now this is Latimer's narrative, and his prevision, in his prevision, he imagines Bertha saying this to him. Bertha in her mind saying this to him, madman, idiot, why don't you kill yourself then? It was a moment of hell. Now, I saw into her pitiless soul, saw its barren worldliness, its scorching hate, and felt it clothe me round an air I was obliged to breathe. So such bitter contempt, and how all these, the emerald brooch and all these things kind of connect. So now, despite this vision that he has of what is going to happen many years later, you know, like the marriage is not yet there, and what is going to, how he's finally going to end, is something that he has already imagined. Is it based on what he understands of Bertha? Yet, it's almost as if, you know, he wants to marry her. So, despite this vision, it does not deter him from marrying Bertha. So, even when he asks Bertha, how can you love Alfred? So, she says, well, why do you suppose I love him? And so he says, how can you ask that? She says, what? Your wisdom thinks I must love the man I'm going to marry? The most unpleasant thing in the world. I should quarrel with him. I should be jealous of him. So, and then suddenly, you know, once the marriage takes place, George Eliot writes, and of course through the narrator says, I shall hurry through the rest of my story, not dwelling so much as I have done on my inward experience. And we suddenly move to the last part, where you know, the father's about to die, and on the eve of the father's death, he says, the veil which had shrouded Bertha's soul from me made me find in her alone, among my fellow beings, the blessed possibility of mystery and doubt and expectation was first withdrawn. So the kind of hatred that she has for him, he sees on the eve of his father's death. And you know, finally, when we move to the last part of this particular story, he says, I will hasten to finish my story. Brevity is justified at once to those who readily understand and to those who will never understand. So we see the wit here, but we also see how George Eliot is trying to pack everything within, you know, the short story. So we have Charles Munier who comes, and Charles says, I want to make an experiment on this woman. This is on the house help. He's seen the house help, and he's given his verdict that she's not going to live through the night. He says, if you will give me permission, it can do her no harm, will give her no pain. And he says, I want to try the effect of transfusing blood into her arteries after the heart has ceased to beat for some minutes. So much of medical science, and George Eliot's, you know, of course, her own relationship with G.H. Lewis, and the fact that he too would conduct experiments in physiology. So all that is, of course, there. So when they entered, Munier had already opened the artery. Now the house help is dead, but once the artery is open, the transfusion has taken place, you know, he says, Latimer says, I could see the wondrous, slow return of life. The breast began to heave, the inspirations became stronger, and the eyelids quivered. And what does she say? She looks at Bertha and she says, you mean to poison your husband. The poison is in the black cabinet. I got it for you. You laughed at me and told lies about me behind my back to make me disgusting because you were jealous. Are you sorry now? And she dies. So, of course, this particular scene it also carries Gothic elements. So the Gothic is also, it's interesting that here is a story that we are analyzing in terms of medical science, clairvoyance, of course gender, but in terms of the times, also the Gothic. And so some critics have also found the scene to be very lurid. And how does the story then end? Immediately after this, he says, it's the 20th of September. I know these figures I have just written as if they were a long inscription. I have seen them on this page in my desk, when the scene of my dying struggle has opened upon me. He had predicted, and like his prediction, the story ends with the 20th of September, when he, according to his clairvoyance and prevision, is going to die. The story does not end in that sense. There's ellipses. Bertha, and after this particular episode of the house elf, Bertha and Latimer separate. They stay in different places. He does not reveal all this to anybody. Charles does not reveal it either. And she, of course, owns half of the assets that Latimer has. And that's how the story ends.
Uh, uh, what have we learned from the story as being written in the middle of the century and talking about the previous decades and the later decades? What exactly do we learn? It's a story that poses lots of problems. What do you say?
I think the first question that comes to mind is, why did she hate him so much? And her own views on matrimony, where she says that love is not possible in marriage. Why? Because, people are only going to quarrel. So, what stands out in this story, more than Latimer's clairvoyance, is actually Bertha's strength somehow. And she chooses to then remain the way she is.
So friends, Professor Payal Nagpal has presented a point of view that is very convincing, but at the same time very disturbing for us to consider regarding the life in England in the 19th century, and particularly the dilemmas that the women of the time faced. So I think this story has a lot to learn from, and it compels us to go into the intricacies and the mysteries of human existence at a particular time, caught in the middle of what one can call the interests of the market, the interests of the world, etc., as well as he rightly said, the interiority of the human mind. So you have to consider that, you have to raise these questions yourself, and answers are not given, but since it disturbs, therefore humankind has to go over these things in a serious manner. Thank you.